Okay, let's get through the last half of chapter 10. We're going to finish talking about the endocrine system. So this system is so fancy. We just finished talking about the thyroid glands and the hormones produced there. The parathyroid glands are on the posterior side of the thyroid gland. So there's typically 4 small rounded nodules on the posterior side of the thyroid gland. You can see 1, 2, 3, and 4. Oddly, some people are born with fewer or even more than that. So there's variability in humans, but they're embedded in the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. So if you look here, remember the thyroid follicles that we saw before? Right here, this is a thyroid follicle with simple cuboidal epithelium around it. Here's a thyroid follicle. This is where thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, are produced. And this would be the parathyroid gland. This large glob of cells here is parathyroid gland. And the parathyroid cells, or chief cells, produce parathyroid hormone in response to low calcium concentrations in the blood to bring it back up. Now remember, calcitonin was the hormone that's produced from C cells or clear cells or parafollicular cells in the thyroid gland. So there's C cells nearby to the parathyroid gland where there's chief cells that produce parathyroid hormone. And together, those two hormones regulate calcium in the blood. So calcitonin, when calcium is too high in the blood, brings it down. And parathyroid hormone, when calcium is too low, brings it up. Parathyroid hormone is the major regulator of circulating calcium because calcium that's too high in the blood is pretty rare. You store most of the calcium in your body in bone. So if it does become too low, you can go get it from the bone, basically. But very rarely is calcium too high in the blood. So parathyroid hormone acts to regulate calcium ion concentration at 3 tissues: the kidney, the bone, and the digestive system. So increasing calcium reabsorption in the kidneys basically keeps calcium in the body. So when calcium is too low, parathyroid hormone helps bring it back up by inhibiting calcium excretion in the urine, by reabsorbing it from the kidneys back into the blood, and increases calcitriol production. Now look at this word. Calcitriol is not calcitonin that's secreted from C cells. Calcitriol is vitamin D, another name for vitamin D. And vitamin D helps increase absorption of calcium from the digestive tract. So vitamin D is really important in calcium absorption. I'm sure you've heard that, or if you take a calcium pill, usually it has vitamin D in it as well. That's to help calcium absorption in the digestive tract. And it also causes release of calcium from bone. Remember, bone is your storage depot for calcium. So if you need more calcium, one of the first places to go is to go get that calcium from bone and break bone down, which frees up calcium. And here's a summary slide of how this happens with regard to the homeostasis. So this is a summary slide of what we just kind of talked about here. So if calcium in the blood is too high, calcitonin gets produced from C cells, stimulates calcium storage in bone and more excretion from the kidneys that brings calcium back down. But if it drops too low, then parathyroid hormone gets released, and the responses or consequences are basically what we just talked about to bring calcium back up. So this whole slide is just a summary slide to kind of help you study and help you understand calcium homeostasis in the blood. Parathyroid hormone on peripheral tissues basically mobilizes calcium from bone by affecting 2 cells in bone. We've talked about osteoblasts with a B that build bone and osteoclasts that break bone down. So basically what parathyroid hormone does is inhibits osteoblasts from doing their job, which basically reduces how much calcium is deposited in bone. And it stimulates osteoclast activity, which erode bone and free up, basically release calcium, and that allows calcium levels to rise in the blood. Again, to reiterate, it enhances calcium reabsorption from the kidneys, sending it back into the blood instead of it being excreted. and it stimulates formation and secretion of vitamin D3, which is calcitriol, at the kidney. That enhances calcium and phosphate absorption, which is also important because calcium is stored in the bone as calcium phosphate. So that helps absorb those two minerals from the digestive system in the food that you eat. The adrenal glands, up on top of the kidneys, have two sections, a cortex and a medulla. And we talked about the medulla when we talked about the hypothalamus, because that's one of the three areas of the sympathetic nervous system, ganglia. Remember, the hypothalamus has cell bodies that axons project all the way to the adrenal medulla. And then the ganglionic neurons located there secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. Well, now we're going to talk about the cortex. And the cortex has a bunch of zones. The adrenal cortex can produce more than 24 different steroid hormones. Remember, steroid hormones we talked about just very briefly in the last lecture can pass through cell membranes because they're lipid derivatives. So they're a lot like the lipid membrane of cells. And that lipid membrane, steroid hormones can get easily through. A specific example of these steroid hormones would be corticosteroids, and the major corticosteroid is cortisol. They basically can affect genes in target cells because they're lipid derivatives. Their receptors for these hormones are inside cells, can be on DNA, and it can affect transcription and translation of DNA, and then consequently cellular metabolism. The adrenal medulla we talked about before, so I'm not going to spend much time on it, but it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, again, in response to regulation from the hypothalamus, or communication from the hypothalamus. So these three zones, look at all these hormones. The outer zone in the adrenal cortex secretes aldosterone or mineralocorticoids. We'll kind of talk about some of these. Another zone secretes androgens, and the middle zone secretes. So you can see the zones here. There's a darker outer zone. So this is the capsule in the outer portion of the adrenal cortex. So down here is the adrenal medulla. So there's one zone right here. Second zone right here, this lighter zone. And the third zone, the outermost zone right here. That outer zone, again, primarily secretes aldosterone. And aldosterone's target tissue is the kidney. So along with antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone helps regulate blood volume and blood pressure. The central zone, the middle zone, secretes cortisol or glucocorticoids, this group of anti-inflammatory steroid hormones. And then the innermost zone secretes androgens, which are another type of steroid hormone that can be converted to estrogens. And that's another summary slide that just basically blows up the last figure that we looked at. The pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. So remember, there's two hormones that regulate blood glucose, insulin and glucagon. And the exocrine pancreas is most of the pancreas volume. There's clusters of pancreatic acini that have ducts around them. An exocrine gland secretes its enzymes or whatever secretions into a duct. And that's basically the role of the pancreas in the digestive system, is the exocrine pancreas. Well, the endocrine pancreas is completely different in that it secretes two different hormones, insulin and glucagon. So here's your pancreas. This is where it's located. The pancreatic duct, the exocrine function, empties these exocrine secretions into the small intestine, which is this right here. The endocrine pancreas has cells, endocrine portion of the pancreas has cells that cluster into pockets called islets, or pancreatic islets, or islets of Langerhans. And they're small groups of cells that are kind of clustered together throughout the exocrine cells, and they cluster together. There's two different types of cells: alpha cells that secrete glucagon that help bring blood glucose up when it's low, and beta cells that secrete insulin that lower blood glucose when it's high. So if you look at a cartoon figure, these are all pancreatic acini. These are all the exocrine cells. And pancreatic islet cells cluster together in alpha and beta cells. The primary hormones, again, that regulate blood glucose are insulin and glucagon. So after you eat a meal, blood glucose goes up in the blood, insulin gets secreted to help lower it. And basically, insulin tells your cells that blood glucose is available and there to take up. And that is the stimulus. Insulin binds to receptors on almost, but not all, almost all cells in the body. And that's a signal to that cell that glucose is available in the blood and can be taken up into the cell and be used to make energy, ATP. So insulin increases the rate of glucose uptake, right, and utilization by cells, but it also increases, because there's more glucose available, glycogen, the storage form of glucose, can be synthesized in skeletal muscle and liver. When blood glucose drops, basically the opposite happens. Rate of glycogen breakdown increases, so now you're not making glycogen, you're breaking it down. And that allows the liver to release it into the bloodstream to keep blood glucose high. And there's another kind of summary figure like we did with the last slide. The pineal gland, we won't spend much time on this, but it's a really small gland in the posterior portion, but the roof of the third ventricle in the brain, and it produces melatonin. And basically melatonin production is influenced by the visual pathway. It's highest production at night, so melatonin production goes up when you turn out the lights, and lowest during daylight hours. So it has a circadian rhythm. Right here's the pineal gland, right there. So here's the thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland we've already talked about. But posterior to the thalamus is the pineal gland, this little tiny gland here. It's made up of just pinealocytes that secrete melatonin. And basically, melatonin can function as an antioxidant, so it's really good for you in that it fights free radicals. Like some vitamins can be antioxidants, like vitamin E. But also melatonin plays a really heavy role in circadian rhythm. So daily, like 24-hour cycles is a circadian rhythm. And it helps you get sleepy at night. So when the lights go out at night, when you're laying in bed, melatonin production goes up and helps you fall asleep. One of the biggest disorders, and which is why we're going to spend time on it, is diabetes. It's an endocrine disorder. So endocrine hormones are secreted most of the time in a cyclical pattern. It goes up and goes down. So insulin goes up, blood glucose gets taken up into cells, insulin production goes down as blood glucose falls. So the insulin production increases and decreases in it respond to how much blood glucose is available. But if insulin production is interrupted, basically an endocrine disorder like diabetes is characterized by hyperglycemia. And hyperglycemia is just really, really high blood glucose levels. And that basically disrupts metabolic activities throughout the whole body. Cells start to shift to using fats and proteins as an energy source because this hyperglycemia over time causes damage in the pancreas. And the pancreas can no longer, or there's some damage to the pancreas to begin with, where blood glucose stays really high, but insulin production doesn't follow, or the cells stop responding to that insulin production. The receptors stop responding. So then there's two different types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is insulin-dependent diabetes, meaning that the pancreatic beta cells that produce insulin don't produce enough insulin. So patients typically need daily injections or continuous infusions. A former friend of mine was type 1 diabetic, and she had an insulin pump that was constantly injected into her abdomen. And when she needed it, or after a meal, insulin would be injected so that as blood glucose raised, the insulin being injected into her could tell her cells that glucose was available and take up that glucose and use it. The type 1 diabetes isn't very prevalent. There's not a lot of cases, and it often develops in childhood. So it can be diagnosed very early, and it's a lifelong disease. It's a disease where your own body's immune system is attacking the pancreas and destroying the cells that produce insulin so they can't. Type 2 diabetes is non-insulin dependent. So the pancreas is producing insulin normally, but as we eat and eat and eat more food, there's more and more and more blood glucose. And there's more, because there's more and more and more blood glucose, more and more and more insulin gets produced. And your receptors to insulin stop responding to so much insulin. They get worn out and they can't keep responding. They've done their job too much and they start to quit on us. It's the most common form of diabetes. It may produce normal amounts of insulin or too much insulin, and then the body, but except for the body cells don't respond. So what happens is called insulin resistance. It's mostly associated with obesity. So it's considered adult onset diabetes, but it can be self-induced. You can be predisposed to it. It may run in your family, but you can also have a pretty decent diet and exercise as an effective treatment, but there's sometimes where medication is necessary. But basically, this is characterized by insulin resistance. So the receptors to insulin are not responding to insulin production. And when that's the case, the cells aren't receiving the signal that glucose is available, and they can't take up that glucose because they don't know it's there. So what happens is cells start to rely on proteins and fats as fuel, and blood glucose stays high, which is hyperglycemia. So it can cause some really nasty effects. And those effects can be something like diabetic retinopathy. So partial or complete blindness can occur because of damage in the retina where photoreceptors are located. Increased risk of heart attack from blockages in cardiac circulation. Diabetic nephropathy, basically degenerative changes so the nephron's located in the kidney, right? So degenerative problems in the kidney can lead to kidney failure. Neuropathy can lead to damage in nerves because of abnormal blood flow to neural tissue. And if there's abnormal blood flow to tissue, you can get damage to those peripheral tissues where blood flow is supposed to go, but it's not getting there. And you can actually lose a limb because of this. It can be really, really severe if diabetes is not treated or not cared for. So the stress response is what we're going to finish with. Any condition that threatens homeostasis is a form of stress. So when stress is long-term, it can be a physical or emotional stress. So you can have physical stress or emotional stress, and the pattern of hormones and physiological adjustments in response to this stress is called the stress response or the general adaptation syndrome. And there's 3 phases: the alarm phase, the resistance phase, and the exhaustion phase. So the alarm phase is your fight or flight phase. Its immediate response basically is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So immediately it's fight or flight. Your energy reserves are mobilized, mostly glucose, so like glycogen is broken down, and the body prepares for this fight or flight response by producing tons of epinephrine. The resistance phase lasts a bit longer. It's a few hours, and the body moves into this resistance phase by producing glucocorticoids like cortisol, and that's the dominant hormone with help of epinephrine, growth hormone, and thyroid hormones. And basically what this does is your energy demands are higher than normal. Neural tissue has a high demand for energy in general, and then glycogen reserves that were once adequate in the alarm phase are pretty much exhausted. So you deplete glycogen over several hours. And that means that blood glucose may not be able to be regulated very, very easily or very efficiently. So metabolic reserves get mobilized, and tissue metabolism is actually shifted away from glucose where it's possible to try to spare blood glucose. So cortisol has this big blood glucose sparing effect to try to keep blood glucose high so that other tissues try to use other fuels. The exhaustion phase is the 3rd phase, where lipid reserves can basically maintain the resistance phase for weeks or even months. So this is chronic stress. And when those reserves are depleted, the body enters this exhaustion phase where you can get mineral like sodium and potassium electrolyte imbalances that can cause neurons and muscle fibers to malfunction. And without immediate corrective action, organ systems can fail and you can die. So it can be really, really serious. This is an overview of that general adaptation syndrome. And that does it for chapter 10. Thanks for listening, guys. I will see you in chapter 11.